October 2016, police found a man's body folded into the trunk of a car at a MARTA station in southwest Atlanta. He had been tortured for more than an hour, then shot twice in the back of the head, and the men responsible kept living in the house where he died. Prosecutors called it one of the most brutal killings the county had ever handled. What got him killed traced back to one decision he'd made years earlier, in another state after a conversation with the police, but the man who set it all in motion has never been charged. Christopher Dean was 33, a father of 2 young boys, and by the fall of 2016, he was trying to work his way out of the only trade that had ever made him money. He sold marijuana around Lithia Springs, a suburb just west of Atlanta, and for years he had driven the whole way to California to buy his supply in bulk. People who knew him described a man doing his sums, figuring on one more run, one more sale, and then a clean break to raise his sons like an ordinary father. The people planning his death were counting on exactly that impulse. The danger he was in had started on the West Coast. In March 2015, Dean was arrested in California on drug charges, and facing that case, he did the quiet thing that so many men in that position do. He agreed to cooperate, becoming a confidential informant and handing investigators information about the people supplying him. Those same suppliers fed another Atlanta dealer he ran with, a man named Brian Dye, and Dye, by the account that later came out in court, belonged to the Gangster disciples. The cooperation paid off for Dean in the narrow legal sense that mattered most to him. In August 2016, his California charges were dismissed. Then he made the error that no amount of caution could take back. He told Dye. Dye was locked up in a Georgia prison by that point, and once he learned that his old partner had sat down with law enforcement, whatever bond the 2 men had was finished. 2 of Dean's friends would later describe Dye threatening him and his family, and Dean began telling the people close to him that he was convinced Dye meant to have him killed. Remember that name, Brian Dye, the man behind bars who felt betrayed, because the entire chain that ends in a MARTA parking lot begins with him, and because of where he is at the end of the story. For months then, Christopher Dean lived as a man who believed he was being hunted. He told friends that Dye wanted him dead, that the threats had reached his family, and still he stayed in the trade he was trying to leave, still doing deals, still driving to sell because the money was the thing that was supposed to buy him out. That is the cruel mechanics of how he was caught. The same hustle he was using to escape the life became the doorway his killers walked through to reach him. A man who fears an enemy in prison doesn't expect that enemy's reach to arrive in the shape of a familiar customer placing a routine order. That is exactly the shape it took. One of Dean's and Dye's regular customers was a man who went by Tommy G, Christopher Lockett. Lockett had bought from Dean before, which is what made the pretext so easy to believe. In the days before the killing, he set up a straightforward sounding deal. He wanted 6 pounds of marijuana, and he arranged for the handoff at a house on Sandy Creek Drive in southwest Atlanta. That address belonged to 2 brothers, Xavier and Orlando Gibson. It was not where Lockett himself lived, and that detail matters. Lockett ran things out of a different house across town on Marcone Street, a place wired with his own security cameras, and he was careful to keep the killing away from it. The morning of October 17th, 2016, the pieces started moving before Christopher Dean had left his own driveway. Around 9:30, Xavier Gibson walked into a store near the Sandy Creek house and bought a long-handled red dustpan, the kind you'd reach for to sweep up a mess you didn't want to touch. A small, ordinary purchase caught on the store's own camera hours before anyone arrived. At Dean's place in Lithia Springs that same morning, a friend watched him packaging marijuana to sell and heard him mention that Tommy G wanted 6 pounds. To Dean, it was the last piece of business before the clean break. To the men waiting for him, it was the bait. The phones tell the rest of the setup. Through late morning and into the early afternoon, Lockett's phone and Dean's phone traded calls, and Lockett's phone kept opening lines to the men he'd pulled together. A driver, a lookout, the cleanup crew, all of it coordinated in the hour before Dean showed up. Cars came and went from the Marcone Street house on Lockett's own cameras, men crossing between that base and the house on Sandy Creek where the deal was supposed to happen. None of this was a fight that broke out. The movement in the hours before Dean arrived reads like an operation with assigned roles. Vehicles ran back and forth between the Marcone Street base and the Sandy Creek house. An SUV, a truck, a Charger pulling in and backing out, carrying men toward the kill site and returning for more. One of the group, Joshua Rooks, worked as the driver, ferrying people to the house where Dean would be killed and later coming back to collect the cleanup crew. Others were positioned to watch. By the time Dean turned onto Sandy Creek Drive, the house was not a place where a drug deal happened to go wrong. It was a room full of men waiting for one specific person to walk through the door. At around 1:30, Dean's car reached the Sandy Creek house and he called Lockett, the way a man does when he's pulled up outside for a sale and wants to be let in. The moment his call landed, the phones around lit up. The men who had organized the day trading quick calls to pull the last pieces into place, positioning the driver and the lookout near the house as Dean stepped out of his car. Whatever he thought he was walking into, the people inside had been arranging his arrival for hours. He walked in expecting to sell 6 pounds and drive home to pick up his son. He never made either. What happened inside that house over the next hour is the reason prosecutors would spend years struggling to find a comparison for it. Christopher Dean was set upon almost the moment he was through the door. He was beaten with a 2x4 and a crowbar for more than an hour. Not a quick killing, not a robbery gone wrong in a matter of seconds, but a sustained, prolonged assault. He was sexually assaulted and burned in the course of it. Only after all of that was he shot twice in the back of the head. The autopsy would later confirm what the scene suggested. The 2 gunshots were the medical cause of death, and one of them was fired with the muzzle pressed against him. The mark of an execution rather than a struggle. But the injuries that came before tell the longer story. Extensive fractures and blunt force damage to his skull, inflicted before the gunfire, so severe that one investigator described his skull as depressed, caved in from the beating. The shots were the end of a long ordeal, not the whole of it. When it was over, they put him in the trunk of his own Toyota Camry, the car he'd driven there for a sale, and turned to the problem of making all of it vanish. The plan for that was as cold as the killing. The car, with Christopher Dean inside it, was supposed to be burned. The body and the weapons and the evidence destroyed together in a single fire. For the dirty end of the job, money changed hands and 2 lower-level men were brought in to handle the disposal. Jasper Green, who recruited a younger man named Lamar Allman. Their task was to clean the house, drive the Camry somewhere quiet, and set it alight. By the time those 2 arrived, the men who'd done the killing came out of the house shirtless and sweating and rattled, told the pair that the body was already in the trunk, said to wipe the place down and burn the car, and disappeared into the wood line behind the property. Green pulled on latex gloves, handed a pair to Allman, and told him the dead man in the trunk had been killed for cooperating with the police. The first time in this whole sequence that the reason for any of it was said out loud to the men holding the shovel. Green buried the gloves in the backyard. The choice those 2 men made next is the hinge the entire case turns on, though none of them could have known it at the time. Burning the car the way they'd been told to meant risking being seen setting a fire with a body inside it. In a city with people and cameras everywhere, leaving it meant walking away fast and clean. They chose fast. The Camry never burned. They drove it to the Hamilton E. Holmes MARTA station, a public transit lot on the west side of the city, and left it there. The car, the body, and the weapons used to torture Dean, abandoned rather than destroyed. The GPS in Dean's own car marks the trip out of the neighborhood in the early afternoon and the moment it rolled to a stop in that parking lot a little before 3. Station cameras caught the 2 of them walking away. Green handed Allman $500 for the afternoon's work, and the crew scattered. Back in Lithia Springs, the ordinary machinery of Christopher Dean's life kept turning without him. He was supposed to pick up his son, and he didn't come. When a friend, worried, called around to ask whether the sale had gone through, the man who had lured him, Lockett, said Dean never showed up. By then, Dean had been in that trunk for hours. The next day, the car was found. His body was discovered in the trunk of the Camry at the Hamilton E. Holmes MARTA station on October 18th. For the investigators standing over it, there was no suspect, no motive, no name attached to the men who done this. Only a father of 2 beaten past recognition, executed and dumped in a commuter lot, with the tools of his own killing sitting in the trunk beside him. Everything about the scene raised the same question, and it's the question that runs underneath this entire case. Nobody who knew Dean could point to a debt, a beef, or a reason for a man to be tortured for an hour over a marijuana deal. The answer wasn't in Atlanta at all. It went back to a rule older than any of the men who'd been in that house. A rule set down decades earlier in another city by an organization that treated one particular act as unforgivable. To understand why Christopher Dean was worth an hour of somebody's afternoon, you have to understand the Gangster disciples. The organization whose code cost Christopher Dean his life was not born in Atlanta and did not start out as a machine for killing. The Gangster Disciples grew out of Chicago's South Side in the 1960s, out of the same landscape of civil rights struggle, poverty, and neighborhood self-defense that produced a generation of black street organizations across the industrial North. In 1964, a 13-year-old named Larry Hoover joined a small crew called the Supreme Gangsters, and for years that crew warred with a rival group, the Black Disciples, run by a young leader named David Barksdale. The two sides fought until they didn't. Toward the end of the decade, Hoover and Barksdale agreed to a ceasefire and merged their followings into the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, and within a few years that combined, Body dominated the Chicago gang scene. Barksdale died young. Kidney failure took him in 1974 at 27, and Hoover took full control. Even from prison, he kept the organization from flying apart. When the Black Gangster Disciple Nation began splintering in the late 1970s, Hoover, by then locked up on a murder charge, held it together by knitting a wider alliance of street and prison gangs into a single umbrella, a coalition that became known as Folk Nation. It was an early demonstration of the thing that would define his career, and decades later, the killing of Christopher Dean, that Hoover could command from inside a cell, and that the organization's reach did not depend on any one man being free. Over the following years, the alliance fractured and reformed more than once, splitting eventually into separate disciple factions. But Hoover's wing, the Gangster Disciples, became the dominant name. What set the group apart from the ordinary neighborhood crew was its reach. It recruited heavily out of jails and prisons and pushed outward from Chicago into dozens of states, planting itself across the Midwest, and crucially for this story, deep into the South. The organization first appeared in force in Memphis in the 1980s and spread steadily through the Southeast, and it kept a heavy presence inside the prison system, where its recruiting never stopped. That prison pipeline is part of why an organization founded in Chicago could set the terms of a killing in a rented Atlanta house decades later. The code travels with the men who carry it in and out of custody across state lines. Federal estimates put its membership in the tens of thousands, spread across at least 35 states. Two very different pictures of what that membership means have always existed side by side, and an honest account has to hold both. Members themselves describe the Gangster Disciples less as a gang than as an organization built around growth and development, a brotherhood with a code, a structure, and obligations. In interviews, members have talked about the group as a source of discipline and accountability, about older men steering younger ones away from the streets, about running community drives, feeding the homeless, and holding one another responsible for the way they treat their families and neighborhoods. In their own accounts, members describe going out in bad weather to hand food, water, and clothing to people living on the street, eating last after the homeless are fed, and steering teenagers away from the very life the group is accused of running. Whether that generosity is the organization's true face or a recruiting tool is a question people tend to answer according to what they already believe about it. They point to the symbolism as proof of that identity. The group's core signs are the six-pointed Star of David and the pitchfork, or trident. The star a nod to the co-founder David Barksdale, King David, and the fork a symbol of the struggle to rise above oppression. The 6 points of the star stand for 6 principles members recite as the spine of the organization: love, life, loyalty, knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. Even the initials get folded into a numerology, the 7th and 4th letters of the alphabet standing in for G and D. And the brotherhood is described as a code with teeth. Members talk about a set of expectations they're held to, from providing for their children to carrying themselves a certain way, with the group policing its own for falling short. Joining is not casual. The widely described initiation involves being beaten into the organization by other members, a ritual meant to prove a recruit will endure something on the group's behalf. In that self-portrait, the Gangster Disciples are a demanding brotherhood, and the discipline is the whole point. The other picture is the one drawn by law enforcement, and it is far darker. Federal authorities describe the Gangster Disciples as a criminal enterprise, a structured organization involved in drug trafficking, racketeering, fraud, assault, and murder. In that telling the language of growth and development is a veneer over a business that moves narcotics, launders money, and enforces its rules with violence. The truth of any large organization is that both descriptions can hold at once, that a group can genuinely give some members structure and family while functioning at the level that draws federal indictments, as exactly what prosecutors say it is. What matters for Christopher Dean is that the enforcement side is not a rumor, and that its logic reached all the way down to a rented house in Southwest Atlanta. Nowhere is that logic clearer than in the story of the founder himself. Larry Hoover was arrested in 1995 after a long joint investigation by state and federal agents, one that used wiretaps to establish that he was still directing the organization's illegal business from behind bars. He was convicted 2 years later on charges that included conspiracy, extortion, and money laundering, and sentenced to multiple life terms. He was shipped to the federal supermax at Florence, Colorado, the most secure prison in the country, precisely because the government believed a cell had never actually stopped him. Decades later, Hoover would publicly claim to have renounced his gang ties, and in a development that put fresh attention on the organization's footprint, his federal sentence was commuted in 2025. The takeaway from Hoover's career is the one that hangs over the Dean case. This is an organization where discipline runs from the top down, where a leader can direct violence from a locked room, and where the chain of command is built so that the man who gives the order and the man who swings the crowbar are never the same person. By the time Christopher Dean was killed, that machinery was operating in Metro Atlanta in a way federal prosecutors had already begun to map. 6 months before his murder, on April 27, 2016, a federal grand jury indicted around 32 Gangster Disciples members and associates across the Atlanta area on racketeering charges. That indictment laid out the organization the way the government understood it: a national body with board members, governors, enforcers, and coordinators, a hierarchy that enforced its own rules through fines, beatings, and murder. It alleged that the Atlanta operation had committed multiple murders and attempted murders, trafficked large quantities of drugs, extorted rap artists, and run frauds costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. 2 years later, a superseding indictment added still more defendants. None of the men who killed Dean were part of that federal case. His was prosecuted separately in state court, but the federal indictment matters because it independently confirms the exact structure and the exact rules the state would later point to at his trial. It was not one prosecutor's private theory that the Gangster Disciples enforced discipline with murder. The federal government had said the same thing about the same city in writing months before Dean died. It helps to understand the city Christopher Dean was killed in. The year he died was Atlanta's deadliest in nearly a decade. The city recorded well over 100 murders, the most since 2008, and its third straight annual increase. His killing landed in the middle of a genuine spike, at a moment when the city's machinery of violence was running hot. How much of that violence traces back to gangs is a harder question than it sounds, and it's worth being honest about the numbers, rather than reaching for the scariest one. Georgia gang investigators have been quoted estimating that the overwhelming majority of violent and property crime in the state is somehow gang-connected, figures in the range of 70 to 80%. That number gets repeated a lot, but it is an extremely broad, self-reported estimate that folds property crime in with violence, and it reads more like an advocacy figure than a measured statistic. A different study, looking at a sample of just over 100 homicide cases handled by a major case unit, found that at least 30 were tied to gang violence, closer to a quarter, and a very different picture. The two numbers aren't measuring the same thing, and the gap between them is really the whole story. Depending on who is counting and what they count, the share of Atlanta killing you can pin on gangs runs anywhere from a quarter to nearly all of it. More recently, state officials have put Georgia's gang population in the range of 127,000 members across some 1,600 gangs, and have credited aggressive gang prosecutions with a sharp drop in Atlanta homicides since 2022. Those are large claims, and like the others, they mix city, county, and statewide figures together, so they are better read as a direction than a precise measurement. The safe conclusion is a narrow one. Atlanta's overall murder totals are knowable year to year. The city was in a bad stretch when Dean was killed, and the exact share owed to gangs is genuinely contested. What is not contested is that the organization behind his death was real, structured, and operating at scale in the city at the time. The pattern the Dean case fits, gang violence used to settle a grievance and enforce discipline, keeps recurring in Georgia. Years later, federal prosecutors would charge another set of Gangster Disciples in the state over a cycle of retaliation killings, a reminder that enforcement through violence is not an aberration in this organization, but a feature of how it polices itself. Dean's murder stood out for its cruelty even inside that world. The reasoning behind it was routine, and of all the rules that structure enforces, one sits above the rest. Cooperating with the police, talking, informing, testifying, snitching, is treated inside that world as the one truly unforgivable act. At Dean's trial, gang experts described the Gangster Disciples as an organization for which an informant is not merely disliked, but marked, someone who can be beaten or killed for the offense of having talked. That is the piece that reaches back and explains everything about the house on Sandy Creek Drive. The details of Dean's case make the rule look almost abstract in its cruelty. His cooperation was old, years in the past. It had happened on the other side of the country. The case it touched had nothing to do with the Gangster Disciples in Atlanta and posed no threat to a single man who beat him. By any practical measure, whatever Dean had told California investigators was dead information. But the code doesn't run on practical measures. It runs on the idea that a man who has once crossed the line can never be trusted again, and that letting it slide signals weakness to everyone watching. Under that logic, the harmlessness of Dean's cooperation was beside the point. What mattered was that he had done it at all, and that word had gotten back to a man who took it personally. He was killed for the principle of the thing, for having been, in the district attorney's framing, someone bold enough to cooperate with the police, and to make an example that anyone paying attention would understand. That code did more than get Dean killed. It should also have made the men who killed him almost impossible to touch. A gang murder carried out for the express purpose of punishing cooperation is, by design, a crime nobody's supposed to talk about. No witnesses, no statements, a wall of silence that has swallowed thousands of cases like it. On paper, this was exactly the kind of killing that goes unsolved for years or forever. The reason it didn't comes down to a single decision made in the last hour of the operation by the two men handed the job of erasing Christopher Dean. The break in the case was the fire that never happened. Everything the men who killed Dean did carefully in that house was undone by the one thing they got wrong at the end. Instead of burning the Camry down to a shell in some quiet spot, the two men assigned to the disposal left it whole, in a public MARTA lot, under the cameras. That choice preserved every piece of the crime. The body, the murder weapons, the traces of everyone who'd handled them, and, through the paperwork and the address trail inside the car, the road straight back to the house on Sandy Creek Drive. A destroyed car would have left investigators with almost nothing. An abandoned one left them with an entire case. The Camry turned out to be an evidence locker. Inside it, alongside Dean's body, investigators recovered the crowbar and a piece of the 2x4 used to beat him, pillows in a kitchen chair and bedding carried out of the murder scene, their long-handled red dustpan and clothing, some of it marked with Xavier Gibson's name. Forensic testing tied specific people to specific items from that trunk. DNA on the clothing linked back to Dean himself, to Xavier Gibson, and to another of the men, Quadhes Clark. And when investigators pulled the store surveillance from that morning, there was Xavier Gibson buying the red dustpan hours before Dean ever arrived. A man shopping for cleanup supplies before there was anything to clean. The address inside the car led investigators to the house, and the house was worse than the trunk. When they searched the Sandy Creek property, they found blood throughout, in the kitchen, in a small side room, on the back porch, down in the crawl space, and the blood matched Christopher Dean. Furniture and bedding in the house matched what had been dumped in the Camry. A length of lumber matched the board found with the body, and buried in the backyard were the latex gloves from the cleanup. The most disturbing detail was the most ordinary one. The men had gone on living there in the middle of it for weeks. The district attorney later said what unsettled him most was that they had been comfortable enough to let the evidence of the crime simply sit. The rest of the reconstruction came out of the technology the men carried and the cameras they'd installed themselves. Cell site records and the Camry's own GPS let investigators rebuild the afternoon step by step, tracing the movement between the Marcone Street base, the Sandy Creek kill site, and the MARTA lot. The final irony was the surveillance system. The cameras Lockett had mounted around his own house recorded the vehicles and the men shuttling to and from the killing. Footage turned against the very people who had set it up. Piece by piece, the evidence assigned each man a place in the afternoon. The dustpan receipt, the DNA, and the papers in the trunk put Xavier Gibson at the center of it, in the house that was both the kill site and, for weeks after, his home. Clark's own words placed him there as a lookout, and his DNA on clothing in the trunk placed him closer than lookout suggested. The phone and location data traced Rooks along the roads between the base and the kill site and back. The driver's route laid out in cell towers. Green's account of an innocent afternoon collapsed against his own earlier written statement, which matched what the cooperating witness later described, and over all of it sat Lockett. Not a man the evidence placed with a weapon in his hand, but the one it placed at the center of the planning, handing out money and directing where the body would go. The arrest came in a wave. Xavier Gibson was taken when the Sandy Creek house was searched in November. Jasper Green and Lamar Allman, the cleanup crew, were arrested in early December, and Lockett, Joshua Rooks, and Quatis Clark were picked up soon after. Interviewed at the end of the month, Clark first denied knowing anything and then admitted he'd been at the house as a lookout. Said he heard 2 gunshots and ran, leaving his shirt behind. The shirt that would later carry his DNA into a courtroom. In February 2017, a grand jury indicted 7 men on murder and a stack of related charges. 2 names, though, were missing from that indictment, and both of those absences matter. By the time the case reached trial, the 7 had split into different tracks. Orlando Gibson's case was pulled out to be handled separately. Lamar Allman, one of the 2 men who'd driven the body to MARTA, agreed to cooperate and testify against the others, becoming the insider who could narrate the disposal from the inside. That left 5 men to be tried together in the spring of 2019. Lockett, Xavier Gibson, Clark, Rooks, and Green. The state's theory tied the whole thing back to the man in the prison cell. Prosecutors argued that Brian Dye, betrayed by Dean's cooperation, had directed Lockett to have him killed, that Lockett had organized it and recruited the others, and that the murder was carried out to punish an informant and to further the interests of the gang. To make that case, they leaned on Allman's testimony, on the surveillance and the phone and GPS data, on the blood and the DNA, on Clark's own admission that he'd stood as a lookout, and on gang experts who explained to the jury why a man who talks to police becomes a target. It's worth being precise here. The claim that Dye ordered the killing was the prosecution's theory of who was ultimately behind it. What the evidence directly established was the motive, the threats, and Lockett's role as the organizer on the ground. The defenses ran in different directions, and the most striking of them came from a man who wasn't even on trial. Called as a witness, Shakur Wright testified that he alone had killed Christopher Dean, and that he'd done it in self-defense during an argument over the price of the marijuana. It was an account that would have shrunk an hour of torture down to a single desperate moment, and the jury rejected it. Green offered a version in which he had wandered into something he had no part in, contradicted by his own earlier written statement. Rooks argued he had only been giving people rides and had no idea what he was driving them toward. Clark, who did not testify, rested on the idea that he had merely been present. The jury didn't buy any of it. In April 2019, all 5 men were convicted of murder and the related charges, the verdicts sorted carefully by each man's role. The driver and the cleanup man cleared of personally assaulting Dean, but convicted as full participants in the killing all the same. The sentences came down hard. Lockett, the organizer, was given life without the possibility of parole. Clark received 2 consecutive life sentences, plus 5 years. Green got life plus 3. Rooks and Xavier Gibson were each sentenced to life. At the hearing, Dean's father spoke about a son who had been trying to get his life on the right track, and about the impossible job of telling a 5-year-old that his father was never coming home. Prosecutors said none of the men convicted had shown any remorse. The 2 men who hadn't stood trial with the others were dealt with afterward. Shakur Wright, the man who had claimed the killing as his own, pleaded guilty in early 2020 and was sentenced to 100 years. A plea that swept in not only Dean's murder, but a killing 11 days later and an armed robbery months earlier in which he'd shot a man who survived. Prosecutors held him responsible for the physical torture Dean endured. Orlando Gibson pleaded guilty about a year later and received 15 years in prison, followed by 15 on probation. Lamar Allman, the insider whose testimony had helped convict the rest, had his charges left pending while he cooperated, and what finally became of his case is not recorded in the public trial and appeals record. One of the loose threads this case never tied off. That killing 11 days after Dean's was its own grim footnote to the story. A man named Benjamin Thompson went to Lockett's Marcone Street house for what looked like another marijuana deal, and it ended with Thompson, who was unarmed, shot dead, and a second man beaten. Some of the same men were involved, in the same house, using the same kind of violence around the same kind of deal. That overlap became a weapon in the courtroom. Prosecutors were allowed to put the second killing in front of the jury to show that Clark's presence at Dean's murder was no accident, that a man who turns up for 2 lethal drug deal ambushes 11 days apart is not simply an innocent bystander. The courts were careful about one distinction, though, and it's worth holding on to. The second killing carried none of the informant motive that drove Dean's. The men and the method repeated. The reason did not. It's a caution against folding every act of violence by this crew into a single story of gang enforcement. Some of it was exactly that, and some of it was just violence. There is a bigger loose thread than Allman, and it is the one seated at the very start. The state's entire narrative began with Brian Dye, the man in the Georgia prison who felt betrayed, who threatened Dean and his family, who prosecutors said set the killing in motion. Dye denied belonging to the Gangster disciples and denied making the threats, and a prison record from that year, in which he had asked to be housed with a fellow disciple, was used to rebut his denial. But denial or not, the fact remains, Brian Dye was never charged in Christopher Dean's murder. The man the prosecution named as the source of the whole thing was never tried, and the direct question of whether he ordered the killing was never put to a jury. It is the single largest gap in an otherwise thoroughly proven case. 2 other questions were never fully answered either. No verdict ever pinned down which man actually fired the 2 shots into the back of Dean's head. The case was built on the principle that everyone who shared the plan was equally responsible, so the state never had to name the shooter, and it didn't. And there are smaller unknowns that never got resolved. Whether Dean's cooperation in California ever led to a single arrest of the suppliers he named is not something the record answers. He may have given up information that went nowhere and died for it anyway. The exact words of Dye's threats, and whether they reached Dean directly or through others, stayed vague, filtered through the memories of friends who testified years after the fact. And the precise sequence inside that house, who did what, in what order, over that hour, was reconstructed from the aftermath rather than witnessed, which is why the account can be confident about what happened to Dean's body and far less certain about the choreography of the men around it. The convictions held. In 2023, the Georgia Supreme Court affirmed the cases of the 2 men who appealed, rejecting Rooks's argument that he had been nothing more than an unwitting driver and Clark's argument that he had merely been present. The court's reasoning came back to the same principle that had run through the whole trial, that a man who knowingly drives the killers or stands as their lookout is as guilty under the law as the man holding the weapon. The court did flag one problem. Evidence of a later arrest of some of the men with guns and drugs probably should not have been used the way it was, edging toward an argument that they were simply the kind of people who commit crimes. But it ruled that the mistake made no difference, that the rest of the case was strong enough that the verdicts would have been the same without it, which leaves the question the title starts with. A father of 2 was lured to a house, tortured for more than an hour, executed, and dumped in a commuter lot, in a case prosecutors called one of the most brutal they had ever seen. And almost no one outside Atlanta has ever heard his name. Part of it is that Christopher Dean was a drug dealer himself, which kept the story from ever becoming the kind of clean, sympathetic headline that travels. Part of it is that nearly 3 years passed between the murder and the trial, and the prosecutions then came out in separate pieces over several more years, so the case never had a single dramatic moment big enough to lodge in the national memory. And part of it is that Atlanta's larger gang and racketeering cases, the ones with famous defendants, kept crowding it out of the frame, so it faded. A killing carried out to send a message, remembered mostly by the family left with an empty space and the prosecutors who couldn't find anything to compare it to. 5 men are serving life, 1 is serving 100 years, and the man the state said started it all is still out there, never charged. The answer to the biggest question in the case sitting exactly where it did the day Christopher Dean's car was found. There is a particular kind of injustice in a killing this deliberate being this forgotten. The men who did it left a trail almost comic in its carelessness, a body under cameras, a house they never cleaned, phones that narrated their own movements, and still it took the better part of 3 years to bring the case to a courtroom, and longer for the last pleas to land. A father was tortured to death to prove a point about loyalty to an organization he never belonged to, and the point was made to an audience that has largely never heard the story. Christopher Dean's 2 sons grew up without him over a rule written in Chicago before any of them were born. That is the whole weight of it, and it is the reason the case is worth telling.